Back in March, as shelter-in-place orders took effect across the country, there was a curious phenomenon. People suddenly took on homesteading hobbies, like making homemade bread and gardening and canning. I realized this was happening as ingredients became scarce. Vacant flour shelves, a friend having yeast shipped to Tifton from across the country, even pickling spices and pectin were hot commodities. For years, I'd been too busy for canning, but during lockdown, I returned to that time-worn practice of preserving the excess bounty from my garden and local farms. Canned goods do provide some food security in lean times, but perhaps most importantly, they also give us joy and the comforting flavors of home. Often, canned goods are shared, given as gifts, or preserved with a certain meal or a holiday in mind when special guests will gather along with family. Love and sunshine go into the jars, just waiting to burst forth, maybe months later, on a dreary day when we need it most. As folk singer Greg Brown says, "Taste a little love of summer. Grandma put it all in jars." Well, friends, it turns out God's been canning too, during Coronatide and long before. And now, when we really need it, God is popping the lids off jars full of love and light, left and right, pouring goodness out on platters to draw more hungry people to the table. You see, in the months and years before this strange pandemic season, at St. Anne's and in other congregations, God's gifts of grace and love, provision, and creativity flourished within the church. Wherever God's faithful people cultivated those gifts for the kingdom, through worship, fellowship, outreach, formation, careful tending or stewardship of those gifts bore fruit that sustained the church then, and there was a good plenty left over. Because God's love always multiplies beyond our needs. Maybe you didn't notice the abundance. It doesn't usually show up on balance sheets, but God saw it and grabbed a spoon. The overflow of love and joy from St. Anne's ministry was gathered up, ladled into holy vessels, and lovingly and proudly placed in the larder until the right season and the perfect time arrived to share it, to entice someone from outside of the family to pull up a chair. A full and ever-expanding table is God's delight, just as it is many grandmothers' delight. Family, neighbors, strangers, and even enemies gathered round. We see this in the scriptures today, which show us God's inclusion of those outside of the family, the chosen ones who received God's promises. In today's passage from Isaiah, God expresses a desire to welcome those outside of the community of Israel into Abraham's covenant and the promised restoration of Judah. I will gather others to them, besides those already gathered, God says, referring here to eunuchs and foreigners who had previously been excluded but now observe the Sabbath. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, God says. In the gospel passage, Jesus is confronted with a Canaanite woman, demanding healing for her daughter. It's perplexing that Jesus ignores her at first, and the disciples ask him to send her away. She is a Gentile outside of the Jewish family, and long-standing divisions are at work. But she calls Jesus Son of Man, recognizing his authority, and argues with him that anyone recognizing his authority is entitled to at least a little bit of the feast. Jesus does a 180 and praises her faith, then grants healing to her daughter, Social division disintegrates, and she experiences the kingdom of God in her midst. Jesus feeds her with far more than crumbs. In this unpredictable and lean time, when we may think we barely have crumbs to offer and we're tired and weary, God has been pulling jars from the St. Anne's family larder to invite others to a table of grace. For instance, Father Lonnie's viral video and the subsequent Today Show interview garnered the attention of well over 1 million people in the U.S. and beyond. All over the world, people from different traditions and backgrounds heard a word of hope and encouragement. They were drawn into the love and longing it expressed, and hopefully also to the source of love. We may attribute the video's success to Father Lonnie's creativity, humor, and wicked video editing skills, and those were certainly part of it. But that video would not have been possible without the years of talent shows and other events that preceded it, without the spirited, loving, laughing community that grew because one church family used its gifts faithfully and creatively to the glory of God. Your cheesecake bites, your generous auction checks, your hours of practice produced fruit that all enjoyed in the moment, and your sisters and brothers in the Dominican Republic enjoyed soon after. And then, much later, unexpectedly, excess from that harvest was transformed into a Hamilton parody video, oozing through the internet and inviting people outside of the St. Anne's family to sup with God. Father Lonnie's love letter to the church is also God's taste of summer poured out for a famished world. Your gifts, good people of St. Anne's, went into that jar of goodness that has blessed countless people far, far from Tifton in ways you will never fully know. That isn't the only jar, though. Look around at the ministry flourishing in this parish now, even when you can't gather in person, and listen for popping lids, emergency food bags, an expanding Knots of Love ministry, a new mask ministry. All are God's sublime sustenance for strangers near and far. The family larder is well stocked because you have been faithful stewards of God's gifts to you for so long. Yet a full larder doesn't mean we should ever stop receiving or using our gifts, whatever we have been given in the moment. Jars fill up and get shared, to be filled up and shared again in a cycle of abundance that keeps bringing more and more people to the table, God's special guests. Some of you watching today may be those guests because through a video or some other way you have sampled the sweet goodness of God's kingdom bubbling over at St. Anne's. Well, it doesn't matter who raised you or how. Everyone is family once they've eaten at Grandma's table together. At the table, whether in person or virtually, we are nourished as a community, strengthened to bear more fruit with what we're given in every season of life. God always has an apron on, ready to stir up something amazing with our humble offerings, something better than we can ever imagine. And at just the right moment, gift it to the world, to invite everyone to the eternal, joyful feast where everything tastes like love and home.